Our next speaker, Gurpreet, is from as a consulting director at ICF.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to briefly talk about the renewable mini grids or microgrids in India. I'm going to talk a little bit about the policies that exist, the barriers, and the potential that exists today from microgrids or mini grids. Before I do that, just want to kind of put in front a description of distributed generation systems, as we have it. So if you look at distributed systems, you have your conventional, which could be natural gas based as well, or diesel based as well, which is quite prevalent in India, or you have the renewable energy distributed grids. When you talk about renewable, it could be off grid or it could even be grid connected. And if we talk about off-grid again, we have the really small products, which is what we call the pico solar products, which is like solar lamps and all, which are used for lighting. We move further up the value chain and we move to solar home systems, which just provide lighting and appliances, which could be DC. Slightly more, slightly bigger, we get to the microgrids, the mini grids, and even PV rooftop. Both microgrids and mini grids can actually be hybrid, or they could be a single generation source, which is simply a photovoltaic. Or if they are hybrids, they could also involve diesel with them to provide full backup power. In India, access for all is very important. It's the new priority of the government to provide access to all. The question really is, do you want to supply that power through grid, make the grid reach every home, or do you want to actually start looking at nanogrids, microgrids, mini grids, which are renewable based, add a battery to it, and then over a period of time, as these become more reliable, even start supplying back to the grid at times when the generation is high and the load is less. So when we look at rural electrification and energy access, we look at it in four different categories, starting from isolated mini grids, where the mini grid or even a microgrid serves a certain number of households, can service community facilities and commercial industrial as well. This is at a place where grid is not available, not likely to reach, and therefore the public distribution network has to be built. It could have a hybrid or a single source as well. Then you have the solar home systems, which could be simple DC systems, individual home systems, and Bureau of Energy Efficiency is developing these packages, which are DC packages, appliances. It could simply be your fan or a light, which provides the basic needs, and it is photovoltaic based, and therefore no need for public distribution because it is individual mounted on each homes. Further along the value chain, you have the grid-connected mini grids, and finally the grid extension as well, the possibility that exists for extending the grid. When we talk about grid-connected mini grids, the difference between, say, a small home system or a isolated mini grid versus a grid-connected mini grid is that the distribution network kind of exists. Grid services are available, but the reliability is poor. It could be as low as, say, 10% of the household supply which is connected, and therefore you call the village connected, but the supply is not reliable, and therefore you could have mini grids provide reliability of supply. What we do need to define very clearly is the categories for access. There's the basic services, there's the intermediate services, and the advanced services. When we talk about basic services, we are talking about just providing lighting services, mobile charging, fan, and televisions. But as we talk about intermediate services and advanced services that need to be provided over a longer period, you start talking about community services like a small school, a health center, which also has available electricity supply when it is needed. And finally, when you move on to the advanced services, you start talking about small, industrial applications. And when you say industrial applications, it's not the traditional industry. It's the home industry or cottage industry, where people start to do something at their homes as an extension. And if you're able to provide that, that starts building the demand of power and creates opportunities, livelihood opportunities as well. So there are three types of mini grids that we've looked at. The simple PV and battery, which is without DG. You have your solar PV connected to the load and a battery storage supporting it. You can then also have a diesel hybrid which supports it to provide more reliability of supply. And the third is only a DG set, which also exists in India right now. Coming on to the policy drivers, and I think this is an important aspect when it comes to growing the demand for mini grids and reaching all end consumers in India. In the last 2 years, we've seen progress along at national level and at state level. Starting from 2016, when the national mini grid policy kind of came out, national tariff policy, where it was, we started to think about a mini grid policy to supply 24/7 power to everyone. The UP government followed soon with the mini grid policy, and the UPRC came out with regulations for the mini grids early in 2016. In mid-2016, we had the draft national mini grid policy. Then Bihar Regulatory Commission came out with their mini grid policy. Assam came out with their mini grid regulations. We recently had the Saubhagya scheme by the central government, which aims to connect all households. And now we are expecting a revised national policy in 2018. So there was a draft which came out in 2016. We are expecting a national policy to come out in mini grids. The biggest aspect of this policy will be how do you provide investment support to the mini grids that get established through it, and if they get connected to grid, what kind of support you provide. So what are the enablers, therefore, for mini grids in India? The market potential is big. There are 40 million households, 40 million unelectrified households that exists. Sorry, it should have said that. But so there's a huge market potential. The pace of expansion is very slow. It has taken a very long time. And if we just go by having more grid connection, it will take another 10 to 12 years to connect everyone. So that's an opportunity for mini grid. The business models are being demonstrated, and there is willingness to pay. And I've just mentioned some numbers here, but I'm not going to talk about it. Today, on an average, a rural household spends a certain amount of money on kerosene lamps. If the same amount of money is actually spent in setting up mini grids, they can be very viable and provide much better and cleaner electricity. So, there is definitely need and growing need for having power supply even at the local level. And there is very limited regulatory hurdle as of now for mini grids because there's no environmental clearance and other issues involved except for biomass. What are the barriers? The uncertainty from incumbent grid. So for example, if a mini grid operator sets up investment and sets up a mini grid, what will happen if the grid comes in 2 years down the line? How is he compensated? The challenges associated with setting up a public distribution network, and of course the cost of monitoring and theft. Coming on to my last slide and takeaways, for mini grids in India, we think that the potential is very large. There is a willingness to pay despite what people hear. People are paying almost 10 times. If you do a calculation per kilowatt hour in rural areas today, people are paying that kind of tariff to mini grid providers for the services they need. The challenges are uncertainty from the grid and the challenges associated with setting up a public distribution network. With that, I'd like to end my talk. Thank you so much for listening.